Alright YouTube, storms are coming, so there may be some high wind in this video. Might bleed through in the sound, might have to pull my hair out of my face. But it's time for the Occult Video 60, my occult books blog and occult literature in general. It's a topic I need to discuss. I wanted to add something about the blog back to this playlist, because I had removed some of the older literary materials. Not the literature itself, but the videos about that literature. I removed it from this playlist specifically because I built a new playlist just for occult literature, but I figure there should be one dedicated video. It's video 60, it's a milestone, so I figured I'd put it in as the 60th video here. First to the blog, briefly. If you're interested in the occult, you can find a little bit of everything on the blog. I've released multiple editions on Amazon, works that I've written for like Fruits of Eden, which is sort of an encyclopedic piece of material related to herbalism as it overlaps with the occult. It goes into a little bit of backstory, has encyclopedic content, and also a little bit of how-to content, how to make ink, how to make paper, and so forth, how to make basically like candle wicks out of mullein stems, things like that, things that most other herbal guides don't really contain. They're just an encyclopedia, or they're just a hands-on sort of guide to witchcraft, and the two topics never really overlapped, and so I wanted to make a work that did overlap them. Or Spirits of the Garden, which is sort of the forerunner of that. It focuses a little bit more on the psychedelic. Psychedelic spirituality could be said to be partially an occult work as well, because it fixates on mind-altering substances, including within human ritualism, within an occult spiritual context. I've also released, I believe now, 53 edited works, if I remember correctly. It might be a couple below that, because I may have included a couple of my own works in the playlist, and I can't quite remember, because I know Steiner's Occult Significance of Blood was suppressed. It is out of copyright, but because the translation was newer, even if the student translating it had no copyright over it, they decided to suppress it anyway, which is fine. It doesn't matter. It's one of the newer sort of theosophical works, so it wasn't one of great concern to me, as opposed to some of the, the Grand Grimoire, the Petit Albert or something. But I've edited and released multiple works on alchemy, multiple works like ritual works, grimoires, actual like spell books, which are less diabolical, and I'll get into this, but perhaps a little bit less diabolical in general than some people usually attribute to such works. Spiritual works, I've got an apocryphal work, the Book of Tobit, coming, which speaks about Asmodeus, and speaks about a couple of very, very strange, very superstitious sort of Judaistic rituals coupled with this demon of lust, as well as other works. And so you can just go through. There are 4 links on the left-hand side of the page, above links as well to this playlist, the occult literature playlist as well. As far as occult literature goes, most people, when they think of the term occult or witchcraft in the context of books, they're thinking of a tome of spells, often negative, often used to attack other people, and this is a very Judeo-Christian view of non-Judeo-Christian principles. Most grimoires, though, most actual sort of ritual handbooks, they deal primarily with Abrahamist, sort of Renaissance-era craft, Renaissance-era sort of Christianized rites. If a demon is called at all, then it's being constrained by the power of the operator or the mage or sorcerer or whatever title may be used for this figure. The demon is then usually deliberately threatened with harm if it doesn't do good, if it doesn't do the Lord's work, if it doesn't do what you want it to do. And so it's very Christianized. There are a few exceptions to this. The Enchiridion of Pope Leo does mention a pact with Satan. I do not believe that the pact section is original to the very original document. It's quite old. It's still Renaissance era. But I don't believe that it's original to the actual first manuscript that was made. Enlightenment era, sorry, I believe. The Grand Grimoire has some diabolical content. The Grimorium Verum. The Petit Albert certainly has quite a bit of diabolical content. The Petition of the Jesuits, which right now is under a copyright hold as well. I believe that there will be no problem and it will pass through that, because it's centuries old, so I don't think that that's going to be a particular concern. However, a lot of occult works don't have anything to do with ritualism of that kind at all. A lot of it is spiritually overlapped alchemical content, dealing with the creation of universal medicine or great elixir, dealing with the transmutation of metals, and wrapped up as though it was a natural science guide. This was the sort of science that they had back in the medieval era, back in the Renaissance, back in the early Enlightenment. They didn't have what we consider modern science truly, even in the early pre-modern period. We would think, I think this is something that needs to be said. You look back at even like the mid-1800s, the late 1800s, there were all sorts of snake oil salesmen selling these little hand guides and pills and elixirs and so forth, none of which were borne out by science. And these are essentially akin to that sort of alchemical lore. It was just a different version of the same thing. Most often, what they were going to sell you was something that was mildly psychotropic or alcoholic, and it would make you feel better because it was a mind-altering sort of substance. It contained cannabis, it contained cocaine, it contained a lot of alcohol. It was basically just whiskey with some food dye and maybe some sugar in it or something. And so that was what was being sold, and it's essentially exactly the same as the alchemical receipts of great infamy to the real alchemists at the time, much as the real medicinal practitioners of the era in the late pre-modern period, sort of leading up to the industrial age or shortly into it, frowned upon some of these sort of snake oil cures and some of these elixirs, these magical substances that would put pep in your step and heal all deformities and take care of your fever and so forth. A lot of occult works are blatantly spiritual or even religious. The apocryphal works, some of them, like the Book of Tobit, like the Gospel of Nicodemus. These works mention things that, even in the context of Abrahamism, generally would be seen as superstitious, because they haven't been in the canon for some time. The original King James Version may have included the Apocrypha. Most modern editions of the Bible do not include any of these works. In fact, most modern sort of religious Christians would warn against them as being heresy, or being witchcraft, or being evil, or a trick of the devil, or something like that. But sometimes you have literally religious works. The Vedas would be a great example. Some of the content of the hadiths within Islam, not the Quran, but the hadiths, speaking of jinn, speaking of the dark witch over in the cave, the evil sorcerer of the desert that bewitched us and we destroyed him by the power of Allah, or something like that. You find this in certainly spiritualist traditions. You may not find it in manuscript, but certainly in oral form. And this has popularly taken hold elsewhere as well. A very deep tradition of it within hoodoo religion, hoodoo spirituality. A deep tradition of this within what you would consider Appalachian lore. I've witnessed this myself, having spoken to people around the area. And we're in the foothills of Appalachia right now. We're just in the northern edge. It's not the same as like being in Georgia or West Virginia or something like that, but the lore is still there. There are still the herbal remedies. There are still the folk rites. Everyone's heard about, you take a flower and you start plucking its petals. Oh, he loves me not. And so that's essentially a form of witchcraft when you really think about it. Or blowing the fuzzy things off a dandelion, the little seed heads off a dandelion to try to get a wish or something like that. Or finding a four-leaf clover. These are folk rites. And that's the other and probably the largest core of all of the occult is folk rites. Even some of the actual grimoires, the Petit Albert, most of its content is folk rites. Oh, well, I kept rabid dogs away by wearing the fang of a wolf, or I kept wolves away by mounting the skull of a deer on my barn, something, and lighting this kind of incense. It's got marjoram and sage and rosemary in it. These are folk rites. These are things people assume that they work. They designed the ritual. They employed it. And it seemed to work because it's not very common that you actually get attacked by a pack of wolves, or that you actually see or get attacked by a rabid dog, even back then when sanitation was spare at best, still rather uncommon. It wasn't likely that you were ever going to encounter these things, so they assumed that by performing these rituals, it would ward them off. It can be seen as superstition, or you can see it as more of an authentic type of ritual. It doesn't really matter, though. Even most of the grimoires, they do contain these folkish rites. They are there. You could conduct an excellent anthropological study of some of these time periods and places based on the cycles of occult literature at the time. And another great core of occultism is philosophical. You would think of Agrippa's work. He's best known for the 3 books of occult philosophy, and a 4th work which is spurious. Agrippa didn't write it. It was, though, somebody associated with, or at least familiar with, Agrippa's work, because it shows multiple points of overlap. They had to be familiar with Agrippa's work in order to write this text. But how many people have heard of female preeminence, which I've also edited? It's essentially a social science tract. It does applaud the spiritual and the sacred side of sort of femininity. It does use sort of the pagan example of the heroiness. Of the heroine. It does all of these things, but at the same time, its basic purpose is to excoriate the concept of tyranny in a political sense, whether it's male or female, but it fixates upon the male. That's one point. To lift women up out of poverty, saying no, they shouldn't be involved with drudgery. You shouldn't be joking around about women as though they were dumb animals, because, look at the oracle at Delphi, or the Sibyls, or something like that, or the Muses, or Artemis, or Athena, or any of these other figures throughout sort of the enlightened pagan mythology. Oddly enough, though, I will say this text as well talks about the barbarous and heathen nature of the non-Christians of the time, but it applauds sort of the Greek and Roman, and to a lesser extent sort of the Egyptian traditions of paganism. I find that very funny. They look at classical civilization, they really try to own it and make out as though those were actually like proto-Christians or proto-Jews or something like that. Not necessarily a historically accurate look at these ancient civilizations, but I can understand why they did that. Many of these works are philosophical. Even some of the alchemical works contain elements of philosophy. Just like many of the philosophical works at the time, they contain elements of herbalism that we would recognize as being folkish today, or folkish traditions in general, or even ritualism. They all overlap. So to say that occult literature is always about black magic and cursing your foes is wrong. But it's just as wrong as if somebody who is an Abrahamist claims that occult literature is invariably, it's evil, it's wicked, fallen, and of the devil. Well, a lot of these things are literally just natural science with a thin veil of Christianity over them. A lot of them have to do with proto-chemistry, herbal healing, or folk traditions that shouldn't really be seen really as witchcraft. They have nothing to do with demons. If you want actual demonology, there are texts that contain that, much of which is Abrahamist in feature. Not all of it, but a very large proportion of it. The symbols used, the names and words used to invoke a demon, the practice of constraining the demon, it's all straight out of sort of Judeo-Christian mythology. These were Christians and Jews practicing these things. If you look at Kabbalah, what you're getting primarily is the study of letters within the Hebrew alphabet, words within the Hebrew alphabet, and the numbering system, gematria, and their overlap with the spiritual or divine as found within the Torah, as found within some of their canonical or sometimes non-canonical works. And thus, conclusions are drawn from that, and simply studying these scripts is supposedly an act of holiness. You don't even have to really absorb, you just open it up and start reading it, and that in a way is a sort of penance or prayer. And so that's a little bit about occult literature. As I said, link in the description of my book's blog, I've released many works. There are 4 major categories for the edited works. On the other side, on the right-hand side, you'll find the works that I myself have authored. Each one has an individual link. I couldn't do that for the edited works. There are simply too many of them. And I may add just one link for my own works as well in the future. I may redesign the blog yet again. But occult literature is neither always diabolical, evil, and devilish, nor always white and fluffy and just all about happy things, and really we should go back and we could secularize all of this content. No, not all of it. Some of it really is demonology. Some of it really is what a secular individual would call superstition. So I think those are some challenges that people have to overcome. If they're going to study this kind of literature, you can apply fully modern philosophy, whether Abrahamist or secular or anything else, to texts that are 500 or 600 years old in some cases, and say that you're going to perfectly be able to categorize these things. Because in sometimes the human understanding, the realm of human thought at the time was not remotely the same as it is now. And so you have a text, like the Regimen Sanitatis, that simultaneously talks about the benefits of hand washing and sanitation, which modern science would not frown upon. But then it starts talking about how you should take a little bit of arsenic for some sickness, or drink more wine, which modern science potentially would not smile upon. And so it makes it difficult for people to properly categorize these things. They have a tendency to want to lump it in either it's just natural science and primitive chemistry and it's okay, it's secular, and it's just veiled with spirituality. Or it's just superstition, just a bunch of hocus pocus nonsense, or just of the devil, or just of God. And I don't think that those categories that are held by most people really work or do these texts a justice. That's about all. Peace out.